Welcome back to Wired for Change, where we explore the ideas, people, and technologies reshaping our world. I'm your host, Amy Yee. Technology has shifted the center of gravity for many organizations, and the boardroom is no exception. What used to be dominated by decisions about risk and budgets has now become conversations about algorithms, data flow, and AI driven strategy. My guest today, Matt Davies, is the former CTO of Shared Services Canada and an advisor and a board member across several sectors, and he's had a front row seat to this shift. We'll explore how boards can shift and evolve from oversight to foresight, what helps them adapt, and how they can build confidence in the technology that's shaping the next decade. Because leadership today isn't just about being informed, it's about staying ahead. Matt, welcome to our show today.
Thank you, Amy. Thrilled to be here. Can't wait to do this.
Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about your story and the elements that have prepared you to become a board member in today's rapidly changing environment.
Okay. So, for board member, I think it's been a bit of a journey. I think for a lot of board members, in my case in particular, I went through, board education a number of years ago because I thought, I didn't really know what it meant to be a board member. And I thought going through a program to give me a solid foundation was a great start. Since that time, I've had the opportunity to, I think I'm on my fourth board now across three different industries. So, healthcare, utilities, and now recently financial services. So, from the board perspective, but I also think the career perspective helped a lot because I've had a lot of different roles in my career working in, consulting, then moving into doing a startup organization, having a chance to work in both public and private sector. You already mentioned the role that I had most recently as a CTO, and I'm now just recently joined Strategy Corp as a senior advisor on digital transformation. So I think the blend of working experience plus board experience probably gives me at least some insight in terms of what boards should be looking at, particularly when it comes to technology.
You must have seen a lot, Matt, and it's a real privilege to speak to someone with so much experience, both from the career side and the board side. How are you keeping up with all those boards now?
Well, I think keeping up with the boards is a challenge, but they're all the boards are facing some similar challenges. They're all, I think a big part about being a board member is you're not responsible for the day-to-day operations. As a board member, you're really focused on the strategic oversight and the governance associated with those organizations. But they're all dealing with technology, and I think one of the things we wanted to talk about today was the technology. I think in the last couple of years, there's been so many technologies that are hitting organizations today, whether it be cloud technology or more recently, there's a lot more discussion around AI. I'm starting to have discussions around quantum and quantum readiness. You can see that there's robotics out there, there's self-driving, autonomous vehicles. There's just so many choices when it comes to technology for organizations to take a look at. And it's affecting different industries in different ways and shapes and form. And I think from a board perspective, it's driving a different requirement, much the same way as, boards when I first joined, you always had the accountants, you always had lawyers, and you always had people with germane expertise in the industry in which they're operating. I think technology is now becoming one of those areas whereby you need to have all board members have to have some level of proficiency when it comes to understanding how technology is impacting their organization.
And we're going to come back to that important point for sure in a moment. You mentioned digital transformation earlier as well. So I was one of the early chief digital officers out there when sort of nobody knew what that meant, and digital transformation was just starting to turn technology into more of a strategic driver. Would you agree that it's more firmly a strategic driver now than ever before? And that was like 10 years ago.
Absolutely, but sometimes I think it just takes a while, right? For things you hear about. I think AI has been around for a long time, but it wasn't until recently when everybody started leaning in on generative AI in
Mhm.
terms of how that could help them from their day-to-day life, that it started to have more and more conversations around what the potential uses of AI, generative AI. We're starting to see agents now. All that comes into play, but it doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes it takes a long time for some of the technologies to actually take foothold in the organization. my perspective anyway.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think we're moving, and let me know what you think about this. I think we're moving from this point where they were just looking at maybe IT metrics like cybersecurity and maybe uptime, for example, and now needing to really, as you say, understand how technology is impacting the entire business, how it's impacting their suppliers, how it's impacting the ecosystem and all their users, and multiple technologies at the same time. So tell us how that feels for boards.
In some cases, I think it can feel a little bit overwhelming. There's so many different areas, and I think the hard part and I can only speak from my own personal opinion, but the hard part is how do you understand which of those technologies are most impactful for the organization that you're sitting on, the board as a board member? And I think that's where you really need to lean on the management team that you have supporting you because they're the ones that are paying attention to what's happening in the industry. They're the ones that are paying attention to what's happening with their competitors, what's happening with their suppliers. You talked about the ecosystem in terms of, and I think that's a really important aspect of it. If you just take a look at what's going on in a particular industry, understand what's happening, I think that's going to give you some at least insight in terms of which technologies are having a greater impact because they're not all having the same type of impact at any one point in time, but there's going to be some that are probably more prevalent. If I think about, the adoption of cloud technology a number of years ago, every organization was figuring out whether or not they needed to migrate to the cloud or how they're going to leverage the cloud or whether they're going to change the software that they're using to move more to a software as a service model. Those things all became very topical conversations. But as a board member, you're looking for the leadership team to try and give you insight in terms of where they're leaning in on that so that you can ask the questions, you can gain the right understanding of what they're trying to do because as going back to my earlier comment, you're there to provide oversight, strategic oversight, and you want to make sure that you have the appropriate governance in place and you're adhering to all the necessary compliance requirements associated with any of those new technologies.
Well, and then there's a lot of education that has to take place as well in order to know how to ask the right questions, right? And so sometimes, as you said, it takes a long time for some of these shifts to happen. But now some of those shifts, don't give us the luxury of time and we have to react faster. I wonder, do you have any examples of industries or companies where the board may have had to react a little bit faster than they were prepared to do?
Not so much on the technology front. I think it's been more gradual, but in some cases, it's driving the conversations more quickly. I think on the cyber front, if we were, that's going to force, a reaction sometimes because sometimes those are unexpected events that will occur. But I think in general, boards have time to lean in on it. They can understand the trends. And you start to see, I think some of the challenges are early on when a new technology hits. This again is my observation. It's not always that there is material readily available for board consumption. It takes time for that material to permeate and get out there for board members to lean in on. But I also think I'm a member of a number of different associations. They're all leaning in on it. They all have a way in which you can start to educate yourself. And I think that's the important part. In order for a board member to be able to provide what I would say constructive discussion and conversation and challenge, they need to have at least a base level understanding of whatever that technology is. And I think what you're starting to see is that proficiency, at least I've started to see, the proficiency among board members is growing.
Well, that's good news.
It is good news.
I think more and more we're also seeing the connection between technology and strategy, as we said, but also culture and people alignment within the organization. What are the impacts of a change like AI, for example, on the organizational culture? Or how are they tied together? Or what do boards need to anticipate ahead of time so that they're more proactive as opposed to reactive? Any thoughts on how you bring all of those things together so that a board can help to provide some of that foresight that's needed?
That's a great question, and it reminds me of when I went through my board education program.
Mm.
I think it was towards the very end of that program, and one of the professors we had walking us through that program made the comment. He says, "Never forget," and I think it's Peter Drucker, the culture eats strategy for breakfast comment, and it stuck to me. A lot of the culture of an organization is really dependent from the tone at the top, and that tone comes from the board, comes from the CEO, and comes from the leadership that permeates the organization. And I think about it's a really interesting comment about culture because That is really the most challenging aspect to get. You could have 2 completely different organizations, one that is very risk adverse and very, very conservative. So let's just take AI.
Yeah,
You have one that's very conservative, very risk adverse, doesn't really want to lean in, more of a, "Let's see what the where the industry is going, and then maybe we'll start testing it." And you could have another organization which is very progressive, very innovative, wants to lean in on every technology to see whether or not much more of a risk taking, where both organizations completely acceptable. But I think from a board perspective, you have to figure out what's right for that particular organization. And it does make sense. Having been part of a startup, I felt like we were always trying to push the envelope, trying to figure out what we could do. How do we make ourselves relevant? If you're a part of a more conservative organization, probably taking a slightly different approach. And I think that culture permeates the organization, also permeates in terms of how the organization is going to adopt new technology.
absolutely.
Uh,
And it's interesting when you have some of those forces working against each other. So what if you've got this business imperative, world-changing change to manage, but then you've also got a culture that may not be ready. Maybe it's they've got a lot of legacy thinking or mindsets that they've been around for a very long time doing the same things. When the two collide, what do you do as a board member?
Yeah, well, as a board member, so we again will lean on management's guidance, advice in terms of, but it's you do have the opportunity to challenge, because I think going back to the comment that I made earlier about what's going on within the industry, what's going on within your competitors, because I do think there you can gain competitive advantage. The CTO part of me says you can gain competitive advantage by taking a look at technology and leaning in more quickly. But you also have to make sure that you got the right controls in place in order to, you want to lean in, but you want to lean in with recognizing that there is requirements to make sure that you have the right controls in place, the right oversight in place as a board member. So I don't think there's an easy answer for this one, Amy.
No, I don't think so. You don't have all the answers, Matt.
No, I don't know. I don't know anybody that does. But if you
I think
do
that's
come
a good
across that person, be happy to meet them.
I know, me too. No, this is great, and we're really just trying to get a sense of the landscape and the challenge that boards are facing today. And you talk about controls. Maybe a good example would be to get into the sovereignty kind of topic as something that is very real and hitting Canada right now. A lot of discussions around digital and data sovereignty and what organizations need to think about that and how boards can be more prepared to support their organizations through that.
Yeah, so that's a okay, I was not expecting that question, but okay. No, sovereignty, I've had a lot of conversations on sovereignty.
Sure.
The interesting thing for me, Amy, is that everybody has a slightly different perspective on what sovereignty means for them. And I think it does depend upon, as an organization, what's most important for you. If I think about the challenges, I think about the challenges when I think about data. Where is the data that your organization is storing? Where is that being held? How is it being protected? Like, some of this does come into the controls, but sovereignty also plays into it. Even if you have that, if you know where all your data is, you know how it's being protected. And I'll use the example I've often said when going back into the CTO type role. Where is the data? Because from a cyber perspective, you need to know where the data is. You need to know how it's protected, and you need to know the controls that you have in place. If I think about encryption and quantum readiness, that also comes into play, because now, in terms of being ready for quantum, a post-quantum world, you want to understand what level of encryption is on that most sensitive data. So all of that will come into play. The sovereignty piece is just a part of it. But you can see organizations are now taking a much greater look at sovereignty, sovereignty of data, sovereignty of where do we have stuff. And I think with competing, I think, legislation, requirement, however you wanna look at it. US has one way of looking at it, Europe has a different way of looking at it, and all those things come into play, but the organization has to take a look at what's the legal environment look like for them. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal expert, but the legislation and laws that can come into place with respect to that data will drive the decisions that are made by management in terms of how best to protect the data, and or anything that falls after that, because data is just one piece of sovereignty. I just happen to use that one as an example.
Mhm. No, that's great. And so, would you say that there are some foundational things that organizations can do to get ready for upcoming change as they decide kind of strategy and priorities that they can prioritize now. So you mentioned knowing kind of where all your data is, understanding what your obligations are, for example. These are things that could take very large organizations some time to get to, especially organizations that may have underinvested in this side of things for a while because it wasn't top of mind. It wasn't the top priority. Do you think that there's some guidance there for organizations?
I think the data comment is very relevant. We talk a lot about AI, but AI really depends upon, having good access to data. You don't want those algorithms running off of data that you don't feel comfortable with. And you think about all of the ethical uses of AI, that'll come into play. And part of that is, having transparency. You want to make sure you want to know the source of data. You want to know whether there's any bias in the data. You want to make sure that you understand the algorithm. You want to understand all those different pieces. I think those are all very good questions for any organization that's starting to embark on, if we just use AI as the example. But the data piece is so relevant to that component that you really do need to have a good data strategy and get good approach to data governance in order to make sure that you're going down the path properly when it comes to the ethical use of AI. I don't know if
Absolutely.
that covers everything, but it's just the whole idea is it's foundational, that data component, and it's foundational because of, I said, the ethical use, but it also ties into other compliance requirements, privacy of the data, those sort of things, how it's being used, be able to the explainability aspect, all of that comes into play.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't think about the future without thinking about where your data is now, I think.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and how it's being used and what it's and then you think about all of the insight that's being gathered from that to help the organization, so
It's really kind of a game changer. Would you say that it's comparable in terms of how much of I don't wanna say wake up call because that makes it people sound like people are sleeping, but a while back, there's a bit of a wake up call with respect to cyber and how important cyber is and how game changing that can be for an organization. Would you say that this is the wake up call kind of for data for people?
I I just I think AI is hit. Yeah, cyber is always. I've had a lot of experience in the cyber front.
Mhm.
I think it's always been gradual. There's always something new coming out there. The threat actors don't tell you what they're going to do next, and I think the added challenge of the new technologies hitting on the cyber front creates an even greater challenge for organizations. I do think cyber becomes a wake-up call sometimes because it may come through an incident that has an organization has to address. I see AI as being more gradual, but being a lot more prevalent in today's society. Yeah, I think it's fair. It just doesn't have the suddenness impact of an event.
I'm gonna because we talked about AI and we talked about cyber, I'm gonna mention the article that you sent me on Anthropic and where AI and cyber kinda
Oh,
collide.
yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah.
That's which is a really interesting case where you've got, those 2 technologies at play impacting the others and impacting the organization.
Yeah, I just think that this goes back to, coming back to some of the discussion about as a board member, I think it's important to pay attention what's happening within the industry, and I think we're gonna continue to see those, what I would say, changes gradually over time. Every day there's gonna be some new application of how AI is being used, and you wanna understand that. You wanna understand the potential of that. I think it just speaks to the ever-growing threat landscape that, cyber folks will pay attention and organizations pay attention to, boards pay attention to, and I think the increased adoption of technology and how that's gonna play out. And I think we're at a very as I said, I think we're at a very interesting time with all these different technologies all hitting organizations to some degree in different stages, but they're all hitting them.
We talked a little bit about board sort of expertise in this area and their knowledge and experience in this area. Do you have any thoughts about how to hit kind of the right balance for an organization so that you're having the right conversations at the table, but maybe not every director, I mean, depending on the organization, has that experience or that depth with respect to technology and change and how strategy, technology, and culture all come together. Anything that you've maybe seen or anything that you think is a challenge?
I think you have a that's a great question, and I think it's gonna boil down to, if you think about all boards go through the exercise of taking a look at their composition
Mhm.
in terms of, think about, the conversation around diversity. You want to make sure that you have diversity around the table, and diversity can come in many different shapes and forms. But you're also, I'm an accountant as well as in addition to understanding
I didn't know
cyber.
that.
Yeah, yeah. But you would never have a board made up of all accountants or all
Right.
lawyers or all technology people. I think it's important to take a look at the composition of the board, the skills and competencies of each of the directors and what they bring to the table, and make sure that you have the right skills around that with that composition to be able to answer the questions around technology. So, do I think you need a technology expert? Well, that could be one way a board decides to address technology. It could be that you're going to get a couple of different board members, depending upon the organization. And I've also had discussions around whether or not you need a technology committee or not, and or an IT committee. Does that make sense? Some boards that may make sense, other boards that may not make sense. And I think those are all different challenges I think that every board will face and every organization will face in terms of what's the right composition of the board, what is the right skill sets that we need to be successful, and what's the right committee structure or organization of a board that needs to be put in place in order to make sure that you are going back to that comment about providing the right strategic oversight and governance of that organization.
Mhm.
Kind of a long-winded answer, Amy. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. This is a live discussion here, and I think for people who may not be aware, I think traditionally, technology is often sat within an audit and risk committee or an audit and finance committee, for example, right? But when you have technology impacting so many facets of an organization, maybe the thing to do is just to ask the question whether or not that still makes sense, or how do we structure the committees or discussions around technology so that it's not overly kind of siloed and so that you have the opportunities to see some of those impacts. Would you say that that's fair?
That is fair. And I think the going back to each organization is different. There are some organizations where I've seen it split out where you do have a separate technology or an IT committee, and it's usually because there's a lot going on in that particular area and it needs particular attention.
Mhm,
In other areas, it is part of another committee.
mhm,
I will say that if I just take a look at my time on boards,
mhm,
I will say that the combination of technology and cyber have every year they appear to be getting more and more prevalent. So
mhm.
the discussions appear to be more and more. And I think that's just part of, if you think about the risks that organizations face,
Yeah.
cyber has been growing in terms of the risk that most of the times you don't see cyber as the, oh yeah, we've addressed everything. I think about the conversation, and I've had conversation around the adoption of zero trust model,
Mhm.
and or whether somebody's fixed all their vulnerability. Like I've never heard anybody ever say that. No CISO I've ever met has said, no, no, actually we implemented zero trust. It was done last year. By the way, no, we have no vulnerabilities. We patched everything. Like nobody says that. So risk for cyber is always there. And I think the risk for some of the new and emerging technologies is there. It may just not be as well understood as cyber because I think we've had more time to deal with cyber.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So let's shift the conversation a bit. I think we've looked at the landscape a bit and just sort of scan the surface in terms of some of the challenges that are popping up. I think that let's look at some of the things that can help prepare boards and some of the things that might hold them back a little bit. So even when boards recognize how intertwined, strategy, technology, culture all are, sometimes there are realities that just hold them back from taking action or having the discussions that they need to have at the board table. Have you seen any examples of things that can hold organizations back?
I think if I go back to that adoption, different organizations are more comfortable leaning in on adoption of new technologies than others. I don't know that it ever holds them back. I think once organizations start to realize that it's impacting their industry and they're seeing competitors start to lean in on it, I do think they all, and I think this is part of part of the board, sitting on a board is you're also you know there to challenge the view. Hey, if this is the approach, like you can ask the questions around, well, what do you think about this technology? How is this technology impacting your organization? Do you think that our competitors are taking a look? Like you have the ability to ask those questions. And if you don't, boards don't have all the answers. Good news is boards have the ability to go and ask for outside expertise or outside opinions. And I also think as a board member, you're constantly looking for ways to augment your understanding or your skills. And this is another area whereby board members can take it upon themselves to go get better educated. If they're interested in a particular technology or they think a technology is relevant for the boards they're sitting on, there's nothing preventing them from going to getting the necessary education or improving their understanding of a technology in order to be able to ask the relevant questions around the board table.
Mhm. You say that board members don't always have all the answers. Unfortunately, leadership teams don't always have the answers
Nope,
either.
you're absolutely right.
Having sat on both sides of
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And one of the things that I see that can have a great impact in my experience is just board members who make it okay for the leadership team not to have all the answers, or make it okay for the leadership to come maybe with an answer that is not an awesome answer, right?
Right.
Not as opposed to painting the picture as bright and prepared and perfect kind of all the time. Like you said, we've already implemented zero trust. Everything is perfect. We
Yeah,
have no risk
yeah,
kind of
right.
thing, right? I think a lot of board members that have been really successful in my experience have really opened the door to candid conversations about the real challenges that leadership teams are experiencing and also what leadership teams don't know. I think one of the worst things a board member can say these days is to say, like, you guys have to have an AI strategy immediately while ignoring maybe the current state that an organization might be in or the other challenges that they might have or priorities. I think it's a difficult thing for within the teams within an organization as well to be able to come forward and say, look, we didn't have all the data governance required, or we didn't completely understand obligations, for example. It's a hard thing to admit to, but if you don't set aside the time and resources to address those things, then it won't be possible to move forward as optimally as you would like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, and I would if I just park my board hat for a second,
Mhm.
and jump back into day-to-day operational, when I think about the challenge, although it does tie into the board a little bit, going back to my earlier comment about tone at the top, I think tone at the top is so important
Mhm.
because it really does set the the messaging to the entire organization in terms of how you're going to approach things. And you can take a couple of different approaches when it comes to new technology. I've always tried to take the approach of let people make mistakes, like let
Mhm.
them try, because when you implement AI, you don't know if the algorithm's going to work. You don't know if it's going to be, provide you the use case that you're testing it out on is going to be the perfect use case because nobody has that insight. If they did, they would just start everything. We've got all the right data. Oh, great, perfect. Like that doesn't like I've never heard somebody say, I've got all the right data. I know exactly which algorithm I'm going to use. I know the exact result I'm going to get. It doesn't really work that way. It's trying, experimenting, maybe failing, but
Mhm.
it's okay. I think a lot of it has to do with your approach in terms of how do you make mistakes and feel comfortable making the mistakes and being able to share, okay, this one didn't work, this use case didn't work out. I think we have to move on to something else. I think that's incredibly important. I also think it really does speak to, I spent a lot of time talking about technology, but it doesn't really work without the talent. Like, to be blunt, it's the talent that's the most important. So, you have a talent in the on the team, you wanna make sure that they're feeling valued, you wanna make sure that you're providing the right education and support for them to grow in their knowledge, and they need to feel comfortable that they can embrace the new technology and do so knowing that they might not get it perfect out of it really does come back to the tone at the top in the organization. And as I said earlier, I think the board has something to do with it. The CEO certainly has to do with it, and management has something to do with that.
I want to pick up on your very important point about talent just for a second. And I have a lot of interest from viewers just in terms of, where are the talent gaps today? So I had an episode on, GRC kind of talent
Okay.
gaps and risk kind of understand the ability to understand risks and formulate them, either on boards or on leadership teams or within operational teams. What do you think are some of the talent gaps we have or opportunities to fill some of those talent gaps that we have coming up in light of, technology change?
Wow. It's a pretty heavy question.
You can take a second.
Yeah, no, I think this goes back to, when we were talking a little bit about board composition and board skills, it's not that dissimilar from an organization.
Mhm,
If you think you're going to start leaning in more heavily, I'll just use AI as an example, and you realize that you only have a very small number of folks that understand AI. Because not every organization can have, 5 PhDs or 6 PhDs and all these data scientists. Now they don't it doesn't really work that way.
mhm,
I think the important part is if you don't have that, maybe you can add, some of that talent, but you then need to figure out how do you augment it? You can either lean in on recruiting, so taking a look at the universities and colleges, because I think it's one of the big things is we really need to be providing opportunities for the next generation, looking at the programs, looking what they're graduating, because I found that in some cases in my former experience that some of the brightest and best individuals are coming out of the universities and colleges to be able to contribute. And then if for those that are within the organization that are willing to try and lean in, you have to provide them with the educational pathways in order for them to improve their skill sets. Like I think it's a top down bottom up type approach. You really can bring some folks in that have the mindset to help make a difference, and then you need to give the opportunities for the team that's there in order to lean in on the technology. I think a lot of the challenge that I've seen with new technology comes from part of it is lack of understanding or lack of awareness of what's possible.
Mhm.
That's anyway, that's and you provide the right environment, the right incentives, and the right acknowledgement for nothing breeds success than finding that first AI, if I use the AI, that first AI use case that makes a difference, and then telling people around it. Because then you start to get people excited around, oh, this can work, this can make a difference.
Mhm.
I don't know if that answers your question, Amy, or not, but I found that if you provide the openness and the support, you tend to get a better results.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway here is that it's not just looking at stewardship of technology and how it's implemented. It's a stewardship of your people and their opportunities and the training paths that you're offering them as well, especially as people's jobs start to shift, right? In some cases from what they were doing before to the new reality with changes in operations due to AI, for example, or other shifts in operation as companies simply change and things continue to change very quickly. How are you stewarding sort of those paths for them and those opportunities for them?
Yeah, when I think about but it's not just AI just happens to be the new one. In cyber, we had SOAR. When
Mhm.
SOAR technology came out, it was like, "Oh, okay, we're gonna start automating cyber activities." And like, yes, or RPA, robotic process automation, automating other tasks. Like, so I think there's been that level of opportunity to change the way in which we do things, the
Mhm.
processes that we have by leveraging technology, and it's AI just happens to be the newer one, and we're starting to see how does the algorithm help, and how do we get into the agents? How are the agents helping? And I think that's just going to be part of the journey that we're on with respect to technology evolution.
Okay. I'm gonna ask a tricky question.
Oh, really? I thought you already did.
Any patterns, because you've seen so many different sectors, I'm wondering, are there any challenges or patterns that might make it difficult or easier for boards to adapt to the shift in technology? So, public versus private, for example, or companies that are more digitally native versus companies that are more legacy and sort of been around for 100 years kind of thing. Any patterns in terms of what has been more of an easier path, I guess, for some boards to take than others?
I don't know. It's so much the board as much as the board challenge, although that it does come into it. But organizations that have a large legacy, it's probably a little bit more challenging for them to quickly adapt and pivot because you're always carrying that challenge of your legacy environment. But in some cases, some of the newer technologies can help with that legacy, right? So, but it takes time. So I think the difference for me, Amy, is that the organizations that have a lot more the term I'm familiar with is technical debt
Mhm.
that they've from all of the prior decisions when it comes to technology. It's just a bigger weight to pull. So that's the way I look at it. The anchor is much heavier. There's a lot more to pull in order for it to start moving forward. But if there's the genuine desire from going back to the conversation at individuals with the tone at the top to try and make a difference, you can still get moving. It just might take them a little more time. I think smaller organizations, just by their very nature, going back to the comment I made about a startup, you don't have that many people, you don't have any technical debt. It's very easy to lean in on a new technology and try it than one that's already got the encumbrance of what I would say legacy.
Absolutely.
So
Let's look at accelerating agility for boards. Have you seen any practices or activities that can help accelerate? So, we talked a little bit about bringing in outside expertise, for instance, but you've also probably been a part of tabletop exercises at the board level, right? So, any other kinds of examples of things that you've seen really help accelerate learning for boards?
I actually so you touched on tabletop. I think tabletops are great. I've seen them in the cyber. I've seen many different types of them done with the on the cyber perspective. Sometimes it's tabletop done with just the within the leadership or management team, and sometimes it involves a board. I think anytime you get the opportunity for a board to be exposed, and that's a great example. Boards will then start to understand, okay, how is management prepared to deal with a cyber event? And more importantly, what is the board's role? Because again, going back into the board is not day-to-day operations. Board is oversight, governance. So, but participating in a tabletop exercise or a cyber tabletop exercise is a great way for a board to understand the vast number of decisions that have to be made because every cyber event is different. But there are patterns and there's ways in which to respond. And I think seeing how management is prepared to respond gives the board some sense of assurance or comfort that they at least have a process figured out. If they had to deal with a real event, they have an understanding of what's expected of them. So that's a great example. I also think going back to my comment is there's no reason why you can't leverage outside expertise, come in, get presentations. Those are all good and quite candidly, it's not uncommon for boards to ask management to provide them an update on, hey, what are we doing on a particular technology? If that use AI, for example, getting an update on AI boards regularly, I think are all now getting updates on cyber. I think you'll see that just be expanded into newer areas of technology.
Great.
Okay.
In terms of advice for management teams who are presenting to the board, for instance, what's your own kind of take in terms of how management teams can do that most effectively? Like the idea of too much detail versus too
Hmm.
little detail, or the approach that they can take, or how proactive they should be in terms of bringing up new issues or ideas or opportunities to the board. Any advice for management teams?
Yes, I think for me, it's recognize that the board always has a limited snapshot. They only have a limited amount of time to go through materials. So you want to make sure that you have very succinctly put your material together to get the key messages across. When I think about cyber, it's the question that always popped into my mind when I think about somebody presenting to me on the cyber front. It's like, I want to know if it's a CISO or a CIO or a CTO and whoever's presenting it, what's the stuff that's keeping them awake at night? Okay. And how are you presenting or conveying that message to me? Like, why? And more importantly, you can't just present, okay, this keeps me awake at night. And you don't follow it up with, and here's what we're doing about it.
Mhm.
Because I think that's the hard part. I think that's really there's no, I've seen many, many different types of ways that technology gets presented. But in every case, there's always an effort to summarize it and distill it, whether it's a dashboard or an executive summary. Recognize people are going to go through that information and then they're going to do a deeper dive. That's what I do as a board member. I'll go through all the material, but I'm trying to figure out what are the big ticket items that I should be leaning in on and asking the questions. And I'll go through the dashboards, I'll go through the executive summary, and I'll go through the details in order to figure that out. So if you're presenting, just like when you're presenting to anybody else, it's important to make sure that those messages that you want your audience to understand are right up front and they're obvious. So, and as I said, a lot of it comes out once you have the material. That's just really the starting point for the discussion, right? It's like that's the background. But then when you get into the committee meeting or into the board meeting, then you have the opportunity for the interaction between the individuals.
Mhm. Matt, what was the first board you were ever on?
The first board I was ever on, to be fair, was I was a board observer a long time ago, and the first, I would say, real board was the University of Ottawa Heart Institute Foundation Board. That was the first one that I sat on, and I sat on the Heart Institute board, and I still sit. I don't sit on the foundation board anymore. I still sit on the Heart Institute board because, quite candidly, my father was a huge benefactor of, and my wife's father as well, benefactors. Our families benefited a lot because of the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. So for that reason, I thought it was a good way to contribute back, and also I really care about the organization.
Of course, that's terrific. Any advice you would give yourself, as an early board member from now as a more experienced board member?
I think the best advice I would give is lean in early to understand the organization. I think for a lot of the time, you're so busy when you're first when I was a first new board member trying to make sure I took all the things from my director of education and was going through it. Okay, we're doing this, we've got to do this, like reading all the minutes. I think if I did a better job early on of understanding the organization, because recognizing you're a board member for that organization. So one of the other boards, we had an opportunity to do site visits. And I think that really crystallized, you get to meet the people, you get to meet what happens from a day-to-day perspective. Going back to my earlier comment, you're not doing the day-to-day, but it doesn't hurt for you to do some site visits to see what happens day to day, do tours of their facilities, things like that. Understand how what the organization really is doing and the impact that it's really having on society. I think that would be probably the one thing. I got it gradually over time, but I think it will be one thing I would lean in more heavily as a new board member.
That's really excellent advice, I think, for people who are new board members out there or are considering being a board member.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. All right, let's turn to talking more about the fluency for board members, kind of as a takeaway. So as we start to look to towards the end of this episode, what are some things that we could help equip current board members with respect to fluency in terms of look into these areas more. So it might be, for instance, with respect to data, understand your obligations with respect to compliance. For instance, could be one thing that they could take away and look into a little bit more on their own kind of thing. So where are some areas that are emerging where board members might want to develop a little bit more fluency?
I think we've touched on some of them. I think the AI is certainly front and center. Cyber is it's not it's always it's going to continue to be front and center. It's just changing. So I think those are areas that, and it touches into the piece about data compliance and understanding what you have to do for the laws and regulations and legislation that's out there. All of those are important, but any one of those areas when it comes to technology, again, take a look at the organization that you're a board member and figure out which ones are the most relevant. It's for me, I think I mentioned I'm on, financial services board. I am learning right now because I think as a board member, you're always learning, continuing to learn about what it means to operate in the financial services sector. And that's for me is a huge it's just different from what I've been used to. Not that I haven't spent time in the financial services, but not to the same degree. So every organization is different. And I think that's as a board member, you want to be leaning in. The other thing is ask the more experienced board members. Find out what if one thing I've found with board members is they're very supportive of each other. You can always ask the more experienced board members, "Hey, what should I be paying attention to? What should and some boards set up mentors for new board members and things like that. Those are all very good ideas, but you don't have to do this yourself.
Mm.
You can do this by leaning in, talking to the management team to see what they're looking for from you. Talk to your fellow board members that have been there before and they've been on the board for a longer period of time to ask them, what should I be paying attention to? What stuff should I be learning about? I feel if you have the resources at your fingertips, and I feel that that will help you to become more productive as an overall board member.
Mhm.
Not sure if that answers your question, but
No,
it's probably the best advice I can give for board members joining new boards and anybody starting out as a new board member.
that's great. And you don't have to name any names, but are there board members that you've seen and observed that just have been terrific in terms of moving boards forward? And what kinds of behaviors have they exhibited that have inspired you?
There's a there are I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of different board members, and I've taken something away. For me, I look at the well, actually, it's people that are around the board table. You'll figure out which ones are willing to help you and willing to lean in. I've had board members when I was very early on with a particular board lean over and say, "This stuff, we've been paying attention to this stuff for a while,"
Mhm.
and give you that advice and coaching. I also think that as a board member, it's important to understand the chairs of the respective committees that you're serving and what they're looking for and the board chair overall. I think those go a long way. And you get to watch the different dynamics or skills that they all bring because everybody that I've sat around the table with, they're all accomplished in their career. They've all done something to put them around that table. They all come with a different level of experience when it comes to board experience. And I just think, just like in life, you have the opportunity to learn something from everybody. And I think it's really up to the individual to take that opportunity and to lean in to see how you can leverage the expertise that you're sitting around the table with.
That's great. As we look out to the future, Matt, what are some of the forces that, in terms of technology, that we should be looking out at that are emerging that we should be paying attention to?
I think we've covered a lot of the technologies, but I think the big part is the change.
Mhm.
When I think about, and we talked a little bit about transformation, and I think that's really what's happening in a lot of organizations. There's some form of transformation going on, driven in some degrees by technology, but it's also going back to the earlier comment, it's the talent, it's the people aspect of it. So when I think about looking into the future and that foresight discussion, I think understanding the impacts of the technology and the change that are coming, recognize that it's going to have an impact on the organization and understanding what that means. And I think about, we also had a lot of discussion around the board table about ESG in the last couple of years. I feel like all of those, the ESG component coupled with the technology change, coupled with some of the recent challenges when it comes to different countries, I feel like there's a lot of change going on. And I think the ability to help organizations manage change, help people manage that change is going to continue to be important. And it's probably going to increase in terms of its importance given the sheer number of things that are hitting us.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
No, absolutely. And navigating that change and changing team members that you may have over the next while as well. I think it's going to be quite a lot. And I agree that's probably going to be the biggest the
Yes.
biggest thing, change itself,
Yeah.
essentially.
It changed. And it ties into an area I don't think we spent a lot of time, but a lot of it managing the risk associated with that change, right? Quite
Absolutely.
candidly, is going to be incredibly important.
Do you think we're gonna need to look at risk more frequently, like almost like week to week?
I'd like to think that management is always looking at risk, and that if from a board perspective, it is part of our oversight requirement to make sure that we're taking a look at the risks that can affect the organization and making sure that they're appropriately being managed. So, yeah, I think it's just an ever evolving risk landscape, and it's going to continue to be part of the discussions in the boardrooms.
Mhm. We're at a place now where a lot of people are thinking about Canada and how we can be more resilient, more competitive. What are we gonna be when we grow up, kind of thing. Do you think that there's a role for boards across Canada to play?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to some of the conversation we had earlier about sovereignty. I think is coming more into the discussion in some organizations. And I just think in general, we have a bit of a changing landscape when it comes to the partners that we work with. And I think it's going to tie into third and fourth party risk on the cyber front and who you're going to do business with. And I think that's impacting every organization today. I think we're always going to have change in our environment. I think we're just at a I think some of the challenges that we've had are just driving it to the forefront.
Do you have one piece of advice that we could give to any board member out there that is something that they could action within the next 12 months?
Hmm. Within the next 12 months. I think for board members, I always think about the role. So one, I'll say serving on a board is a privilege, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do so. And I always think as a board member, you should always be thinking about how are you adding value? How are you bringing? What are you doing to make a difference in the organization? And I think for me, and this is a personal comment, it involves making sure that you're doing what you can to make sure that you're educated on the things that are impacting that organization. So I think being a continuous learner or a constant learner in this day and age, there's nobody I know, and we were having a little bit of discussion before we started this around. I've never heard anybody say I've actually stopped. I don't want to learn anything more about technology. I'm good. I think I've got everything. It's like nobody says that. And I think that's very true in the board. I think it's you're constantly evolving. The environment's constantly changing. And I think it's important for you to stay on top of it, to be constantly learning and educating yourself, however you choose to do that. And it could listen to a podcast like this, or you could go and read an article, or you can go and take a course. Like, all those things are options that individuals can take. But I think you want to continue to be improving your skills and your competencies in the areas that you're spending time on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. It's so great to have your perspectives as someone who has got such deep technology expertise, but also such understanding around people and how things work within organizations as well. And it's rare to have a good open conversation like this about boards as well, because I think I sometimes I forget that there are a lot of people for whom boards are still a closed door mystery to an organization where it's like, well, a board member said this, so we've all got to run and scurry and do all these things, and board members are viewed almost as like not human, kind
Oh,
of thing,
well,
right?
okay.
It happens still, right? And
Okay.
it surprises me as well, but it does happen. It's like this godlike voice thing, right? But I think you've helped to really unpack a lot of challenges that boards need to face together with their organizations, and how we can be supportive of the organizations as well as the management teams, and of course, what a privilege it is as well. So I really appreciate that. Anything else that you'd care to share with our audience? And you're this is the first time we've talked about, boards in any depth on this podcast as well. So I
Oh,
really
is it?
appreciate
Okay,
your
wow.
time, you
Did
know.
not realize that, but
We've
no.
talked about it a little bit, like, we've touched on it in conversations, but not to this level of depth, so I appreciate it.
No, Amy, I just say thank you for the opportunity. I think I told you beforehand, this is the first time for me doing a podcast, so I was thrilled to have the opportunity, and it's been a great honor to sit across the table and have the discussion with you today. My hope is that folks take something away from this, and as I said in my earlier comments, try and figure a way to add value and make a difference. Like, those are the things that I always think about, no matter what you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. I'm sure this is gonna be the first podcast of many perhaps for you after this one airs.
Or
Um
not.
Indeed. Well, thank you for your time today, and thank you for watching and listening, and maybe we'll bring Matt back again sometime if he's willing to come back. If you're interested in change and these topics that are impacting society today, really encourage you to subscribe to Wired for Change. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again.